Okay, August 15th, 2013, WXEL Book Club. Our author is Joanna Campbell Slan. And before we begin, my name is Ann Bocock. For anyone who doesn't know that, I want to thank all of you all for being here at the WXEL Book Club. We thank our partner, Murder on the Beach Mystery Bookstore. I know many of you volunteer your time at WXEL, and we are very appreciative. I am a big believer in public broadcasting, and I know that we need a station that is responsive and active in the community. This book club is part of that commitment. And to remind you, we are the PBS station for Palm Beaches. So at the end of our discussion today, we have something very special, so don't leave, because it's a nice surprise today. And I am so pleased to have as our guest today Joanna Campbell Slan. She was born in Jacksonville, so you are a native Floridian. She grew up in Indiana. Before becoming an author, she worked as a newspaper reporter, a television talk show host, a college teacher. You've been a motivational speaker. You've written, if I counted correctly, 18 books?
It's now 22.
Okay, I totally was off. Several nonfiction, more than 11 nonfiction,
Right.
and the rest fiction. Her first novel, Paper, Scissors, Death, was an Agatha Award finalist for her first novel that is quite amazing. Features Kiki Lowenstein, a spunky single mom who lives in St. Louis. There were now 6 of those, correct?
Correct.
One just released. And her newest series, which we're talking about today, is the Jane Eyre Chronicles. It began with Death of a Schoolgirl, which is this book, and it continues with the newest release, Death of a Dowager. This series features Charlotte Bronte's classic heroine Jane Eyre as an amateur sleuth. And Joanna and her husband live on Jupiter Island. I am so pleased that you are here with us today. You know, I've been a news reporter as well. There is not a straight line that goes from reporter to best-selling novelist. So can you take me on that path?
Well, I always wanted to write. When I was a kid, I would staple together papers until I got a pack of paper, and then I would tell everyone in my family, this is my book. The writing part kind of eluded me, but the paper part I got. So the constant throughout the career has been that I love telling stories. I love the idea of giving people an escape. I love creating characters. After I got past the point of thinking that I could self-publish with a stapler and the papers around the house, I started to think about what kind of career I would need. And when I went to college, I started as an English major, but I quickly learned that as an English major, you did a lot of reading and not as much writing. So I switched to journalism, and that's how that started.
What was the day? Tell me, what was the moment where you said, I'm going to write a book?
Well, I had been trying to write a book for some time, and I had made several starts along the path of writing a book. But at the time, I was working full-time as a motivational speaker. I was traveling all over the world. I was speaking to large corporations, and I also had a son, who I still have, but at that time, thank goodness. I don't exactly have him. He's in California, but you get you know what I mean. So he had to be driven to school, like a lot of parents. It was carpool. So my day was broken up. So I couldn't figure out how to write fiction. So I was at a motivational speakers conference, and somebody shoved a mimeographed sheet of paper in my hand, and it said, "Hi, we're 2 other members of this motivational speakers group, National Speakers Association. Our names are Mark Victor Hansen and Jack Canfield, and we've written this book, and it looks like it might become popular. It's a little early to tell, but it's called Chicken Soup for the Soul, and we know as a motivational speaker that you might have some stories that you might like to contribute." I thought, well, I can't write an entire book, but I could probably write a couple of stories for them. So I wound up writing and submitting 5 stories that were accepted by them, and one of them was turned into actually a TV show on the PAX network. And I thought, oh, I can do this in chunks. So then I started writing nonfiction, because you can write nonfiction in chunks. When you write nonfiction, you write a chapter, and then you can get up and walk off, take your kid to carpool, or do the carpool, pick up your kid, whatever. But it wasn't until Michael got his driver's license that I was able to actually have enough time that I could sit down and think through the narratives to write fiction. Fiction is kind of like, writing fiction is kind of like directing a symphony. You have all these voices, all these musical instruments, those are the characters, and they're all moving at once. And so to keep them moving, you need periods of time when you can concentrate on those, and you can devote yourself to getting into those characters and to seeing what happens next.
You obviously have more than one character in your head, because you have Kiki, the scrapbooker modern day time. Then we have Jane Eyre. That, talk about night and day.
That's true. I guess I was the Rodney Dangerfield of mystery writers. I wrote the Kiki Lowenstein mysteries, and I knew that marketing-wise, the market was really interested at the time in what they call craft cozies, which are mysteries that feature a crafter. So I thought, okay, well, I'll write the best book I can, and that's a marketing strategy. So that's what I did. And as you mentioned, it was nominated for an Agatha Award. But in the hierarchy of mystery writers, there's a definite pecking order. And I was down among the amoeba. Except amoeba can have sex, and you can't have sex in a craft cozy. And so I would go to these conferences, and people would say, I would never, ever, ever read a book about a scrapbooker. No way. And sometimes they would get a copy of the book, and 6 months later I would get a note from them, an email, and they'd say, I ran out of everything else to read. I was desperate, so I picked up your book, and I loved it. So I thought, this is not good. This is nuts. So I need to show people I have my writing chops. Spent 4 years in college, worked as a journalist, I worked in PR, I got a silver anvil for my work on Farm Aid. And, you know, wearing a shirt that said, I can write. You know, I was like, what am I going to do? So I was on this panel at a conference, and somebody said, what's your favorite mystery of all time? And I thought about it, and I said, Jane Eyre. And someone else on the panel said, well, that's not a mystery. And I said, well, let's review. We have this weird old creepy house. There's somebody bumping around upstairs who's setting fires. We have an overpaid servant who drinks too much, but she's not fired. We have this depressed man who says he's ruined his life, but he doesn't tell how, and he's wealthy. And we have this little girl who lives with him, but her mother has disappeared. I think there's enough in there to call it a mystery. So I walked away from the panel, and I got to thinking about it, and I thought, yeah. Jane Eyre was always one of my favorite books. Why not return to Jane?
Good news for anybody who has not read Jane Eyre since, what, freshman year maybe, which has been a little while. You're not going to be lost reading this book, so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My first thought was, wow, I'll read a chapter, and then I'm probably going to have to go and find my old copy of Jane Eyre and read that. No, it's all right. Magically, you make it understandable.
I wish it had been magic. I wish I could have waved my magic pen and that could have happened.
So that was really challenging.
It was challenging. It was.
What was the hardest part?
The hardest part was that I wrote the whole book 30 years later than it should have been written. And I had to rewrite the entire book in 6 weeks. That was the hardest part.
You did a rewrite in 6 weeks?
Yes. Hygiene suffered.
I've been think your entire life would suffer.
A lot of things suffer. That's true. That's true.
Have you heard from people that have read the book and loved it, and I know people love it, have they told you now they've gone back to read Jane Eyre?
Yes, they have.
What a compliment.
To me, that was my fondest hope. You approach something like writing a sequel to Jane Eyre with reverence and with fear. I mean, Charlotte Bronte was a genius. She was a genius, and she was raised in this unique melting pot with her siblings, where they were all these fabulously thoughtful, interesting people. They didn't do carpool. So what I had to do was, when I started approaching Charlotte Bronte on my knees, thinking, oh my gosh, this person is a goddess. How can I do something that's worthwhile? And my hope was that the book would be interesting enough that it would bring a new group of readers back to Jane Eyre.
Because, you know, it takes guts to take a book so well known, so beloved as Jane Eyre, and go, I'm going to tell the rest of the story. It could have gone terribly wrong.
It did. That's why I had to rewrite it.
Oh.
But it could have gone wrong in a lot of other ways. I remember my husband sells Steinway pianos, and he works a lot with universities and colleges, and he was proudly telling someone who is the head of the arts department, oh, my wife is writing a sequel to Jane Eyre. And instead of being thrilled, the woman looked at him and said, yeah, right. I hope she's prepared for the kind of flack she's going to get. So you're right. There were some moments of intense trepidation. Am I up for this? Can I do this? Will Charlotte Bronte? Will I wake up and find Charlotte at the foot of my bed with a knife in her hands?
And in the real world, was this a hard sell?
Actually, it was. It was. I remember the first time I tried to pitch it. There is a man who is a super agent. And I said, we were at a conference, I said, do you have 10 minutes? Could I have 10 minutes to talk to you? And so we made an appointment. I went and I met him in the lobby. He didn't look up from his BlackBerry. He's flipping through his BlackBerry. He goes, what do you got for me? And I said, well, I have a continuation of Jane Eyre with Jane Eyre as an amateur detective. Jane Eyre Book Club, Jane Eyre and Mr. Darcy, Jane Eyre and Prejudice, Jane Eyre's been done. And I said, excuse me? You're talking about Jane Austen? Now, remember, this guy's like one of the most prominent book agents in the country. And he goes, Jane Eyre, Jane Austen, it doesn't make any difference.
Oh.
And I said, okay, thank you. So it was a bit of a hard sell to find the right agent, but I did. I found an agent who believed in it. And then it's getting harder and harder to sell books, period, to the publishing companies. Because whereas at one time maybe there were 30 different publishers, there are now 5. Yeah. There were 6 when I started, there are now 5. And basically the way that works is the acquiring editor has kind of a shopping list and says, I want a craft cozy, I wanted this, I wanted that, or whatever. So I was really fortunate though, because Berkeley, which is now, they combined with Random House. And it's so hard because I want to say it's a Random Penguin House, but it's not. It's Penguin Random House. I think they should have gone with the Random Penguin. Personally, I can just, if the gecko works for car insurance, Random Penguin should work for publishers. But I wasn't asked about that. And they probably aren't interested in hearing my opinion either. But anyway, I have a wonderful editor. Her name is Shannon, and Shannon is a huge lover of Jane Eyre, so that was helpful.
Death of a Schoolgirl is the first.
Yes.
Now, when we start in this book, you pick up where Jane's life has left off. She is married, right? She's married to Edward. They have a baby.
That's right.
And of course things are not going to go smoothly or he wouldn't have a book. There's conflict. And there is a murder to deal with.
Yes. People die in my midst.
Yes, they do. And this one was a young girl.
Yes, Yes. And that scared some people off too. I think when you read the book, you don't feel that way about her anymore.
No, not after you know about her.
You know. Yes.
The boarding school itself, to me, was so evocative of the period. I loved how you really got a flavor of that school. Is it based on any particular school?
I did my research. There were definitely schools like that at the time in England. And so what I did was, and I also did research as to the houses and the layout of the houses in London, because unfortunately I had lived in England for a year and I'd been to a house very much like the house that I patterned this after. So you had to know the layout of the house in order for some of the mystery to work. So those pieces kind of came together.
You were so good at the description. I have this house in my mind. We had talked a little bit about Jane Eyre today, relevance. Why do you think it's relevant to continue this story?
Well, the particular story that you have, Death of a Schoolgirl, what amazed me was, of course, the big question in the book is how much responsibility do we take for somebody else's child? And that is a social question that we need to continue to ask ourselves even at this date. Every one of my books has social questions inside them. Even my Kiki Lowenstein book, Picture Perfect Corpse, which is the most recent Kiki Lowenstein book, talks about self-harm, which is an epidemic with young women. The most recent Kiki book that's not out yet will touch a bit, and then later the next book will go further into the fact that there is now sort of a quiet epidemic among adult women of drinking and having problems with liquor. So that's an important thing to me as an author, not to be didactic, but a book is such a wonderful vehicle. I mean, you can't get in your car and go back to the year 1816. You can't get in your car and fly to London. If you can, I'd like to see your car. But a book can take you to all those places, and if I can open your mind and do those things, why can't I open your mind and make you think about social issues? So the social issue in this book is what do we do about other people's children? How much responsibility do we owe them? And what was really odd was, while I was in the editing stages of this book, the Jerry Sandusky trial was coming to a close. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is totally relevant today, because your feelings might be different from mine, but I felt like if you're the coach and you know that something's going on, you owe a huge responsibility because of how venerated you are, because of the strength of your position. You can't just say to someone, I think there's a problem, and walk off. That's not responsible. So it seemed so odd to me that the timing.
And I would not have expected anything less of Jane than to feel responsibility.
Well, and Jane had been in that same situation, because when she had been at Lowood Institution, she had seen how by adults turning their back on those kids, kids died. And of course that came directly from Charlotte Bronte's life. Charlotte Bronte went to a school called Roe Head, and she and her sisters all became very, very malnourished, and two of her sisters, I think it was, died. In fact, when Jane Eyre originally came out, people knew she was writing about Roe Head, and there was this big hue and cry. People were furious with Charlotte Bronte for blackening the name of this school. And finally, other people who'd been at Roe Head started writing letters to the Times and said, no, she's got it right. So obviously, this is a problem that we have not conquered, and it's one that has deep roots.
And if you've ever been in an administrative position in a school, it lives to this day, even in universities that have, you don't know how much, if a student literally disappears, what do you do?
That's a challenge, because I remember even when I was at Ball State, I remember there was a young lady in the dorm where I lived who had some psychological problems, and she went to counseling. And back then, some of the privacy laws, and they're still questioning about privacy. Her parents were contacted, and she was taken home, and the person who was her therapist was chagrined because he said, you know, this is a breach of patient therapist privacy. So this is something that we still we need to think through, and the ethics and the morals with social media are changing faster than we are thinking, and that's a shame.
And that is a problem. You talk about the issues, the social issues. There is an issue of class.
Yes.
That is a thread through the entire book. And I think we as Americans especially are fascinated by British class. And we still are. Look at the royal baby 24/7. We can't get enough of that. And it's interesting. I think living in the UK probably made it easier for you to identify.
It's fascinating that you ask that, or you say that, Anne, because I remember one day I was out on a walk with a neighbor who we had chosen when we lived in the UK to live among the British, not live in an American enclave. Often expats find enclaves where they live with other expats. Our goal was to see what it was like to be a person of a different nationality. So I was out walking with my British neighbor, and another woman walked up who was from the neighborhood. I had not met her, and my British neighbor introduced me to her. And it had been a long time since I'd met an American, just willy-nilly, not through my son's school or whatever. And I looked at the woman, and I realized I was sizing up her class. Now, we say, as Americans, as citizens of the United States, that we don't sort people by class. What a bunch of bunk. I mean, I looked at the color of her nails. I looked at how long her nails were. I looked at the type of jewelry she had on. She opened her mouth. I listened to her grammar, her accent. I looked at the clothes she was wearing, and I immediately sized her up as lower middle class. And afterwards, I walked away and I thought, oh my gosh, this is the same thing, except it's much more subtle here. Now, what I did see in the UK was that it was much more calcified. People believe you are, to some extent, they still believe that you are born into a class and that you will always be that class. They don't believe in the mobility that we believe so much here, or at least that was my impression. And certainly royal watching there is a fine art, a fine art, and I enjoyed it myself.
How can you not enjoy it?
Well, I'll tell you, I went to Althorpe where Diana is buried, and her brother was there. And oh my gosh. I have to tell you that if she looked anything like her brother, I can tell why an entire nation fell in love with that woman, because he's something. But it was amazing. People in the UK would share royal sightings the way we here might say, oh, in Florida, I saw Burt Reynolds in the grocery store. You know, it's the same type thing. It's their celebrity sightings.
Tell me about the research you did for this, because when you invent a character, such as Kiki in the other book, you have all the liberty that you want, time, place, dress, manner of speaking, whatever. But when you are doing a book that needs a historical frame of reference, and that you have to do some research.
I did. Well, and as I said, I got it wrong.
What parts did you get wrong?
Well, I shouldn't have switched from being an English major to a journalism major till after I'd had British literature. You see, Jane Eyre was published on October 16th, 1847. I'm actually doing an event on that date, a virtual event to celebrate 166 years of Jane Eyre. So I thought, okay, since it was published in 1847, the 1850s were a fabulous time in London, the Crystal Palace. I got all these books. I know more about Victoria's sex life with Albert and all their little juicy inside secrets. Man, I was good to go. So I wrote the entire book, 100,000 words, turned it in. As often happens, my editor didn't read it right away. 3 months went by, I'm getting off a plane where I'm doing a book signing in North Carolina. My agent calls in a panic. She says, the editor is concerned. I said, about what? She said, you wrote the book 30 years too late. It turns out there are 2 obscure references inside Jane Eyre that date the time frame of the action in the book to 1818. And those 2 references are, one of them is Bewick's Book of Birds, which this is an 1860 copy of Bewick's History of British Birds. And so after the book was published, I thought I owed myself a treat. So I bought books 1 and 2, and I tell myself as I touch these that maybe Charlotte Bronte actually owned these originally. Isn't that something? So I had to go back and change the time. Now, 30 years doesn't seem like that much until you start thinking about our lives and car phones and, and dials, rotary dials and things like that. Well, back then, the 30 years made a huge difference because there was a train system in the 1850s. There wasn't a train system then, and on and on. And of course, I had a deadline. And they were concerned as to whether or not I was going to be able to make the deadline for publication. So what I did was I wrote during the day and I researched at night. I went online, I bought every book I could about the years, which turned out to be the Regency time. And I'll tell you a little secret, I hate Regencies. So when I was writing a Regency, I hate Regencies. I was like, take a pencil, poke it in my eye, you know. I couldn't believe it, because Regencies are comedies of manner. You know, what happens is that this lord meets this young impoverished girl, and he falls in love with her spirit. You know, she will surrender her virginity. They go round and round and round and round, and finally they marry and live happily ever after. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't write a Regency. I don't want to write a Regency. But I had to research the Regency, so I ordered books like crazy. I haunted old bookstores, used bookstores. I went to my booksellers like Murder on the Beach. What do you have? You know, what fiction is set in that time? And I researched the heck out of it. I also, I have a wonderful online community. I have this great Facebook group of readers, and I sent out a call to them, and one of them was able to provide me with some research information. I contacted it's not philanthropic, it's philatelic, it's the stamp people.
Philatelic.
Whatever.
Yes.
Okay. Take your word for it, yes.
I was a member in England of the Junior Philatelic Society.
See, and I contacted the not junior society, and I sent them a note, and I said, tell me about how the postage worked at the time, and somebody came back and responded, so I did it.
Congratulations. And
Thank you.
What I found, you know, we're talking about the research. There were things in here that a couple of things I found totally fascinating. And one was having George the Fourth on the throne, which was
What?
George the Fourth.
And the other was, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Bow Street Runners.
Yes, Bow Street Runners.
Never heard of that before.
Right. Unfortunately, that was the time before there was an organized police force. And actually what happened was the English citizenry was fighting the idea of having an organized police force because they thought that would just be another excuse for the government and for the king to take over their lives. So as I understand it, what they would have is each parish would have different men who did parish walks. And they would go around at night with a lantern and check to see that everything was safe. Now, they didn't solve crime so much as they tried to be a deterrent. And our modern phrase, hue and cry, came from these guys, because if they caught somebody breaking into your home, they would raise the hue and cry. And people would go chase that person down. Fortunately, I'd been to Wattenberg in Germany, and I had seen a night watchman there, so I had some sort of sense of that. And then from that, what they did was somebody realized that there had to be a police force that could do more. And the Bow Street Runners were formed. They were the forerunners of the modern police force, and there were only 8 of them, I believe. And they were, their primary task was to keep the royalty alive. So they were sort of the secret service of England.
That's what I pictured them as
Mhm.
with the Secret Service. It's interesting. That was a nice touch
And what was
for the time.
Well, and what was cool about the Bow Street Runners, Anne, was that they could go anywhere in the realm. So that gave me a wonderful character because he could move, he could go out to where Jane lived. Otherwise, I had someone who was stuck right there in London.
One thing that was in the book, and also in Jane Eyre, and also in classics that I thought
Yes.
was things were not always what they seem, and there's this underlining of prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
We still have it today. You in the book we assume that a person was guilty or suspicious because of X, Y, and Z, and you nailed that.
We still make those assumptions, obviously.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's why we have young men in hoodies who get shot. And it's a sad thing. One of the things that I like to do as an author is to take what a reader's expectation is, lead a reader down the path, and then say, no, we're going to make a sharp right here. And I tried to do that with, for example, with Jane, because Jane, in the original, refuses to be dressed up. Edward wants to buy her silks, and she says, I refuse to be your little, essentially Barbie doll for the time. So I thought, if Jane felt that way then, and she would continue to feel that way, okay, what would that subject her to? So a lot of times what I have to do is step back and say, okay, if I could visualize my character in front of me, how would other people see this character? What can I use from that? It's all raw material that I can use to have a plot twist or whatever.
I so wanted to see her in better clothes, but what makes her a good detective?
Well, I think a lot of things. In fact, it was so funny, Anne, because once I got the contract to do this book and the word went out, I had so many writer friends that came to me and said, I wish I'd thought of that. But you didn't. She's a perfect detective because she's curious. She is incredibly observant, which obviously, think about Columbo. It was his powers of observation. I thought of her and I thought of Columbo because he was unassuming, and people would ascribe to him a level of I don't know. They didn't think he was very professional. They didn't worry about him. And I thought, okay, she can use that to her advantage because she is unassuming. That's one of the big things in Jane Eyre. She says, but you think because I'm small and I'm plain that I don't matter. I thought, well, that can come in handy. I've found in life that it is a great advantage to be underestimated by people.
Absolutely.
Let them underestimate you. While they're underestimating you, you just go paddle away and work twice as hard as they do. And so I thought, well, that's a great thing for Jane. She can be that underestimate. And the fact that she's married to a country squire, she can now move from one society to another, back and forth. So that's a great thing for her. She's a good learner. She's a fast learner. And as anyone who's been in an abusive situation knows, when you've been in an abusive situation, you get a sixth sense about people. And Jane had been in that situation. She grew up in that situation.
She's a caring person.
She is a caring person because if your protagonist doesn't care, it would be pretty difficult for them to want to take on the burden of being an amateur sleuth. And that's one of the things that all mystery writers have to figure out. You can be like the great Michael Connelly, and you can write about a police character, and he will have a natural reason for being involved in crimes. Or like Kellerman, the Kellermans, they have cops, and they have, Jonathan Kellerman has a psychiatrist, so they have a natural reason. So the question is, if you have an amateur sleuth, what is that person's reason for being involved? And one thing has to be that they have to have a strong sense of justice and a strong sense of loyalty to people. Otherwise, they would not put themselves in those situations.
And she has both of those.
I hope so.
To a fault. You had to invent new characters to make the
Yes.
story flow. That had to be fun.
It was, and I sort of use a system for that. when you think about all of the great sitcoms that have been on television, whether it's the Lucy Arnaz show or Gilligan's Island, you basically have characters who play against each other. So for example, if you think about Gilligan's Island, you have Gilligan, who's the hapless go-lucky guy. You have the skipper, who's always coming up with harebrained ideas. You have the professor, who's incredibly intelligent but very disciplined, and he doesn't move forward on harebrained ideas until he's got the facts. You've got Ginger, who's going to do something but only if it's not inconvenient to her. You've got Mary Ann, who'll go along with anyone. So I break those down into personal styles. It's loosely based on the Myers-Briggs. And I use those different personalities to create an ensemble that is going to have a bit of natural friction, but one character is going to bring something to the party that the other character doesn't. And by doing that, you get kind of a spontaneous combustion. In the end of Jane Eyre, Edward says, I want our honeymoon to last forever, and it's just going to be the two of us. Well, that wouldn't work. I couldn't see two people having that many mysteries within a house besides where are my socks and why isn't this bill paid? You know, so what I had to do was expand their world, but I had to do it in a way that would make for more adventures for all the characters.
Those characters are very well developed, so I know you're not going to leave them behind. You're going to bring them into the future books.
Yes,
Okay.
I hope.
And Jane, I have to go back to Jane being mistaken for the teacher because of where she was and what she had on. We talked about class, we talked about social structure, but the dress was right. That's how she was sized up.
Yes. And of course, she'd also been kind of slightly mussed up. She had had a dust up in the coaching inn, and so she had a black eye. And
That was pretty awful.
yes. And who would think that a lady would have a black eye? So everything about her, she came in through the back door because the front door was occupied. So it is amazing how we take things, our mind is built to think in story. For example, McKenna and I drove down here down 95. If you pass a car sitting off to the side of the road and you see glass on the highway and you see a police car coming, what do you think? There was an accident. Now that's not necessarily so, but our mind takes something and makes a story. And so when Jane walks in and they see she's been banged up, she's poorly dressed, she's not real clean, she's rather disheveled, she's using the servant's entrance, they assume something about her too. So they make a story.
Before we open this up, and we are going to open this up in just a few minutes for questions, I have to know about your writing process. Do you write every day? Do you have a special pen and a desk and any superstitions?
I write every day. I write 7 to 8 hours a day. I have worn the letters off of 3 keyboards. This year so far I've written 2 books. Last year I wrote 4 books. I get up in the morning, I get my dogs up, feed them. I have the same breakfast every morning, oatmeal. I change, I go upstairs, and I sit down and I start writing. And I do a little bit of social media, but writing is a discipline. And when people say to me, oh, I have writer's block, well, think about it. You know, does your dentist have dentist block? And say, I'm not going to go to work today. Some days I write really fluently and things come easily. Some days they don't. And that's what editing's about. But it's a process, it's a disciplined process. And if you're not in the writing ready position, which is butt on the chair, hands on the keyboard, it's not going to happen. And I put in long hours. My husband travels, so he's in and out a lot. And this is all I ever wanted to do in life. I mean, I've progressed, I think, from stapling the papers together. So I'm just really blessed to do that. When the dogs start getting restless, I take them downstairs, and I have to carry both my dogs because the stairs are slick. And then I usually work out, I exercise, and then I start again. And like last night, I finished up at 8:30.
Discipline is the word we're going to underline because it is a discipline and you must be disciplined.
I think that's it, but here's the other thing. If you don't want to do this, find something else to do. I mean, if you really don't want to write, I mean, if you hate the process, why do this? Leave the trees in the ground. You know, I mean,
Do you outline?
I do some outlining. I do outline. I have they say in the writing process there are people who are pantsers, which is they write by the seat of their pants, and people who are plotters, who plot and outline. I'm a pantsy plotter. I would sit down and I'll write about 3 chapters to get the voice of the characters and to get things working. It's kind of like priming the pump. And then I will go back and I have all of these worksheets where it's for characters, worksheets about how to build, where to put the crime, and they're forms that I've collected over the years, some forms I've made, and I'll start filling those in by hand. And then I have a program called Scrivener, and it has electronic index cards. So I'll start plotting out here, this will go here, this will go there, and I can actually move that around. I print that whole thing out, and then I ignore it for the most part. I'll go back to it. But lately what I've actually been doing too is I print out what I'm working on, and you know, cut and paste on the computer used to be, if those who were journalists, we used to cut the paper and paste it together.
Yes.
So I've gone back to the cut and paste method because I just find that really satisfying. And my most recent Kiki book that I'm actually finishing this week, my first chapter was twice as long as this, you know, because it was cut and paste. So I use a variety of processes, and I really like my process, and I'll tell you why. I think to do a really good job as a writer, you have to use everything that's at your disposal, every sense, and every experience. And the way that I'm working, I feel like I'm casting a wide net and then bringing things in, and then I start winnowing down.
You have to have a thick skin at times too, because you're not writing for yourself. And this book is you're submitting it, and somebody's going to go, boy, I really don't like that part at all. Is it hard to get over that?
It is, but here's the thing. If this is really, really what you want to do in life, then why would you listen to the opinion of one person? I mean,
You know your characters better than they do anyway.
every editor is coming from a marketing position where they have to figure out how to market things and to go forward. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. I know now, with 22 books behind me, that sometimes editors are going to make decisions I agree with, sometimes they won't. They have a different view of the books. Van Cliburn was a friend of mine. I knew Van pretty well. And Van said to me that when he played the piano, he played with one foot on the stage, thinking about the music, and one foot in the audience, thinking about how people were perceiving that. And I think that is the mark of someone who is working at a high level.
Wow.
You have to, I listen to what readers say, my beta readers and my editors, but I have to have within me that core of belief that I can do this and I'm good at what I do. But there's a juggling act between those two and a balancing act.
You don't juggle Kiki and Jane Eyre. You go from one completed book to the next one, or do you not?
Well, it sort of depends on the schedule. If, for example, I'm introducing a new series that's set here in Florida. It's actually set in Stewart on the Treasure Coast. And I have a character named Caramia Delgado. And I will be editing, I'm finishing the Kiki book, I'm doing the edits on Caramia, but I'm also doing research for the next Jane Eyre. So I do kind of juggle them. And people say, well, don't you get confused? Well, when you pick up the phone, it's a friend, and then you pick up the phone 10 minutes later, it's your spouse, do you get confused? No, you know, I mean, they're different people, they occupy different quadrants of my brain. Now, I will forget your names because I'm juggling their names, but, you know, I have my priorities straight, I think.
Not everyone can be a novelist, certainly not everyone can be a novelist as well as you do it, but I think that everybody has a story. Now, how do we go from a story to putting it in a written form?
take a pen and a notebook and start writing. Actually,
That's the hardest thing in the world.
yeah, well, and so maybe you don't. If you have a story that's trying to be told, get a tape recorder. I mean, they still make them, I think, and speak your story into it if you need to. But I think the thing that you have to remember is, why am I doing this? If you want Anne to share your story with your family, then they're not going to care about grammatical mistakes, or people start saying, oh my gosh, I don't know. First of all, everybody says I don't know where to begin. Okay, let me tell you, I don't know where to begin. It's like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, remember? You can start here, you can start here, you can start here, you can start here. Start, just start. And a lot of times you get all the way to the end and you go back and you go, well, you know what, this would actually be a better beginning. And you would be amazed at the number of times I restart a book. I start again, or I tear it up, or whatever. That's okay. But if you don't start the process, you'll never get anywhere.
We're going to open it up because everybody has questions. Yes.
My question is, did you need any type of permission from the Bronte estate?
No,
You didn't?
no, I did not. It's in the public domain,
Oh, it is.
so no, I did not.
Yes.
Well, I know that you covered this a little bit, but I asked the question before, so I'm going to ask it again. To me, it must be very difficult to write this period piece that's not your period. And so I was questioning, how does that work? Is the research the part that is the key? But still, that doesn't explain how you get that voice, because the voice is critical.
Well, I used to be a speechwriter, and I wrote for multinational executives of Mitsubishi. And one guy was Cuban, one man was from Canada, one was from Japan, and one was United States. And what I learned to do was to close my eyes and to listen to them, to replay snippets of, because I got to meet each of these men for maybe 30 minutes, and then after that I was tasked with writing their speeches. So part of it is mimicry. And what I would do for the Jane Eyre thing was I would watch Downton Abbey at night. And that would help me get into the correct English voice. And then, of course, there's the fine-tuning, which is I would go look up the etymology of words. For example, the word ruckus. Believe it or not, ruckus didn't exist as a word till 1860. It's a combination of ruction and fracas. And so any time I wasn't sure about the age of a word, I would run it through the etymology thing, and if that didn't work, I would go to Google Books and look up Jane Eyre and see if it was used in the original Jane Eyre. I think the biggest part of it is you have to just have a vivid imagination, and you have to be able to steep yourself in the moment and just be like entirely in that moment. So I'll see myself acting things out. I'll visualize how a character would move. I even one day wrapped an oilcloth tablecloth around myself and walked on the beach when it was cold and raining to kind of remind me what that would feel like. I think it's just mainly I'm weird. I don't wish that on you.
The other question that I have has to do with other authors that I have met in the same kind of a venue have said that their characters sometimes tell them what needs to be written. Does that happen with you?
Absolutely, and I also find that if I do some things that are kind of meditative and I'm open, ideas will come to me. Sometimes it's not that the character talks to me, but I could do this or I could do that.
Thank you so much, Joanna
Thank you,
Campbell
Ann.
Slan. I'm telling you, Death of the Dowager, next on my reading list, and
So fabulous.
and
I can't believe that she started that book and was able to get up from it in writing it, because the whole book just flowed right
Wow.
through.
Thank you.
we have something for you
Oh, hooray!
from WXEL
how
and PBS, and that is a new show that is going to be on.
Peg and Cat.
Yes, but there's also something inside that
You
Just
might enjoy.
you might like
If you already
this.
have it, we'll get you something else. But we love you, and we
Oh,
certainly thank
but
you.
you have seasons 1, 2, and 3 of Downton Abbey. Tonight, we have Downton Abbey Revisited as a pledge show, so everyone should,
Yeah. And season
Call it
4 will
Make a
start in January.
yes, season
Yeah.
4. I
Thank you
can't hardly
so
wait for
much.
season 4.
Oh, that's-
And this is so great because this will get me in my Jane Eyre mood.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah, we
Well,
want you in your Jane Eyre mood.
Oh, thank
we
you.
certainly thank you. You are the most brilliant writer, and if anybody here has not read the book that we just discussed, I really urge you, your writing is beyond brilliant. You should be doing Masterpiece Theater. Your characters are amazing. Your writing is truly perfection in my heart. So I thank you, and you, the person. We can't thank you enough for being here, and I hope that you come again soon.
Please,
I really do.
back.
Well, when Kiki, the next Kiki comes out, that's very soon.